Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me today. I'm walking in the gardens with my dear companions, and there's so much going on. Everything is flowering. Of course, not everything, but all of the beings are preparing for springtime in all their different ways, like a grand symphony of astonishing resurgence, awakening from the winter. There have been many warm days lately here, but today is quite chilly and cool. And there might be a little wind noise in the mic, so I ask that you bear with me in that regard. I'm not entirely sure what I will talk about today, though I have various things on my mind. As if minds were tables that we could put things on. And of course, what I actually have aren't things at all. I guess thoughts are technically things in language, but ideas, motivations. You know, so many people are suffering. People that I know. Some of them are dying or have died. And many, many people are suffering. And some of the people that are dear to me I've lost contact with, and I don't really even know if they're alive. And frankly, from time to time, I'm inclined to wonder if I am. There are these ideas in Buddhism and other religions of something referred to as a bardo, or a between place. And it seems to me that the whole world is in a kind of a bardo right now. The terrible weight of the activities of our collectives on the living beings of Earth and the living places and histories of Earth has become crushing. And this is not new. I've been aware of it for a very long time, more than 20 years. Even I think in my childhood, before I was formally aware of threats and such, you know, from time to time I could see that the human activity was really badly broken and dangerous. And omnicidal. And our relationship, both personal and collective with nature, is the fundamental relationship while we're embodied. And yet there are older and invisible relationships that we're not inclined to think about in our regular everyday thought. And it seems with the pandemic, we've entered a very stormy and confusing layered array of bardos. And not everyone is experiencing them the same way. There's this idea that a thing is a thing, but a thing is uniquely a thing for each person who experiences it, or for each person who experiences what the word or idea refers to. And we have this experience in our cultures of regularity. We go to the store, we buy the thing, the can of food or the jar of sauce or the meat or the bread or the fruits or the vegetables. And we're inclined to think, oh, I know what these things are because I've had these things before. But of course, we are different every time we eat food, or kiss, or walk, or awaken. It's just that our habits of regularity, our mind of regularness, it's a convenience or a number of conveniences, and we rely on them so that we don't have to carefully parse every possible situation or identity or outcome or result, even though we do spend some time doing that as well. Is this apple as good as the last one I tasted? And we're inclined to think that the identities remain the same in the packages, the branding. Campbell's soup is always Campbell's soup. And while that's not untrue, every can of Campbell's soup is different inside. And I think things are much more different now than they've ever been before, particularly with our foods. Oh, there's a dangerous thing. It's not terribly uncommon to find the discarded needles of drug addicts, but one certainly wouldn't want to step on one. So, one of the things that's very clear to me is that our cities require incredible, astonishing activities and commodities to continue even for an hour. I guess when the pandemic first hit, because I live in a big city, I was very concerned, since it's very clear to me that the cities depend intimately on their supply lines. And anything that can disrupt those supply lines can really turn a city overnight into something quite terrifying. Of course, in its own way, our cities are already quite terrifying. The noise and artificiality, the pollution, the garbage, the strangeness, the peculiar developmental circumstance of being embedded with many others with whom we have no direct relation. And I think this is remarkable. And part of the way we got to these swarming throngs of modern collectives is simply the growth of populations. And the imperatives that underlie the forms of humanity that are inclined to dwell in very close proximity to one another, in vast numbers, dependent on the conversion of often distant ecologies into objects and commodities and food and money and power, commerce. I imagine how puzzling it would be for someone from 4,000 or 5,000 years ago to suddenly find themselves awake in a modern city. And I think there's an aspect of that confusion that's natural to all of us, because even though we are born in some time, fairly recently, within us are layers and layers of ancient being, ancient human being, ancient living place being, ancient animal being, ancient soul being. And those aspects of us find little nurturance in our modern world. And I think eventually they mostly learn to hide. And sometimes they emerge when we're dreaming or gain expression there. I see a worm floating on a strand of silk it's emitted, and it's a sign of the time of year that we're in. I like to watch these little worms that descend often from great heights in trees on a single strand of silk they emit. And then when they can sense the nearness of the ground, they climb back up that strand, wrapping it around them into a cocoon. And it's a beautiful thing to observe, a mysterious and astonishing and ancient thing. Sometimes I wonder if our lives are a bit like this. We make this long, long strand. We are descending toward the earth from someplace way up high. And then we climb back up. Midpoints and transformations are often astonishing when we pay attention to them. I notice the difference in my awareness when I'm out walking between when I am coming and when I am going. When I am on my walk, there's some point at which I decide, well, this would be a good time to turn around and head back home now. Usually it's getting late, or I may be hungry. I might have some other need that I need my house for. But once I reach that midpoint, when I make the decision to return, my awareness changes dramatically and I become rather focused on just getting home, rather than exploring and wandering, playing, being with my animal and plant companions. Yesterday I saw cedar waxwings, and I'm not sure if I've ever seen them before and recognized them. I had to figure out what they were called. They're really beautiful though. And one of my I love all the sage plants, the white sage, the blue sage, and particularly the hummingbird sage, which has these giant puffs of flowers, well, big tufts. And they're oily and greasy with this incredibly fragrant substance that I feel must be deeply medicinal. We're always in various bardos. We're in betweens of things. Between today and tomorrow, between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock, between waking and dreaming, between birth and death, between confusion and awakening, between insight and error, between poverty and wealth, between hunger and satiation. And we like to, some of us, get into really deep betweens, which we call relationships. And it's humorous, some of the strange tropes in English that are hidden inside the words. Of course, our awareness of this kind of thing can change, particularly if we're intoxicated or if our mind state changes dramatically. So that under some conditions we will experience apophenia, where we become so sensitive to the particles of words or even the letters that language transforms into a labyrinth of seemingly metaphysical ideas, situations, perspectives. Most often, when this becomes really intense, it's problematical, right? Something has destabilized with our pattern matching abilities. This happens in schizophrenia or on psychedelic drugs or in mania. Perhaps sometimes with people who we refer to as suffering from bipolar disorder. And yet, underneath all of that, there's something reliably astonishing. Like the idea that relations are ships. Now, of course, this is related to a common metaphor in English, that relationships are journeys. Relationships are a way of traveling. And if you look at tropes about relations, you'll see lots of journeying words. Though at the moment, none of the tropes are on the tip of my tongue. There's a great book about this called Metaphors We Live By. Though it's fascinating to discover some of them on our own by just paying careful attention to how ideas are formulated with words and language. It's not necessarily a problem that relations are understood as journeys. Excuse me. But if that's our only metaphor, perhaps our garden is not diverse enough. And this is part of the problem with language. Over time, things tend to collapse into habitually validated tropes and metaphors and analogies, when we'd be much better off if we had 7 or 12 or 15 than if we just had one. I've often suspected that people who speak multiple languages can triangulate on the meanings of words in any of those languages in a way that a single language speaker cannot. And so the library of connotations associated with a word for someone who speaks and is aware of things in multiple languages is an entirely different kind of situation. And vast portions of what we feel and think find inspiration or catalyzation. They're catalyzed. Not on one layer by definitions, right? That is a leaf. But on a vastly richer layer in connotations, and our technologies, well, they're troublingly flat in terms of how language is used. We haven't yet developed systems that could help us to become dramatically more aware and intelligent and available to deep relation simply by including and developing our connotative intelligences, which I think are deeper and older than the linguistic intelligences, the denotative intelligences that most of us often think with and use as tools in thought and speech. Sometimes when speaking, if my vocabulary's up to par, so to speak, there's a trope in English, right? That things are a bit like golf, or that there's a standard that they meet or don't meet, or when we're lucky, wildly exceed. And I guess that's what I'm most interested in, that wild ecstasis, that liberation from the traps and cages that are common culture, thought, and language produce. Lately there's been a slew of posts about animals or plants that essentially pretend that abstract scholarship, while having been the dependable path in academia and other places, are us. That abstract scholarship is what is known, what we know. We being, everyone. It's a very bizarre thing to observe for me when I see an article that says something like, hey, plants are helping one another, they're communal and symphonic in their relationships, and this is supposed to be a big surprise. I guess it's, quote, supposed to be a big surprise, unquote, and perhaps would be to anyone who believed that the fundamental basis of nature was competition. But this was never the case. This was a radical misinterpretation emerging from Darwin's discoveries around evolution and later discoveries around genetics. And it's very strange because the history of human knowledge has privileged bizarre, abstract, almost completely wrong-minded ideas wherever that was convenient to excuse behaviors that would otherwise be inconceivable or simply wrong. If the basis of nature is competition, which it never was, not that that isn't an ingredient in the soup, but the soup is quite rich and complex. There's all kinds of astonishing, mutually beneficial exchanges and transfers and relationships in nature. But the humans, some humans anyway, were already engaged in continuing the terrible stratification of class, power, and wealth and dominance. And so it was convenient for them to interpret these findings in such a way that would result in the declaration that everything's just pretty much competition. But even to have competition, you have to have cohorts. You have to be competing, quote, against someone. Now, I'm very fond, there are forms of competition that lead us to new opportunities, liberation, wonder, learning. There are lots of wonderful forms of mutual competition where we compete together to raise the bar for everyone by combining the unique skills and perceptions and intelligences that are available to us in relationships. And I'm a big fan of that kind of competition. It's wonderful if, for example, in a conversation, I may present some insight that I've had, and then someone, and one of the people who's really good at this is my son, he's really good at it, can take a little jewel from inside my insight, magnify it dramatically, and produce their own insight, or an insight together, that we can have together, that sheds light in places I'd never considered or conceived of. And this kind of competition I really like, especially when it's loving and playful and mutually fulfilling. And romance is sometimes like this. A couple enters into a state of extended play where the unique awareness and intelligence of each person magnifies in the between of them something beautiful or true or playful. It's very common to see couples playing at joking around about each other's common foibles, habits, regular behaviors and such. We were joking the other night. I was speaking with my father, and often when I'm speaking with a man, I find it, who's in a couple, right? It's interesting because nearby there may be their companion is listening, even though they're not really in the conversation. Not intrusively, but maybe I'm on speakerphone or whatever. And this happens with some regularity. Happened to me yesterday in a conversation. But I was on the phone with my father the other night, and we were talking about books, and he was looking for a book I had sent him and couldn't find it, and his wife was nearby listening, and he said, I don't really buy books very often. And I said, yeah, that's not surprising. And he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, why would a guy who knows everything want to buy books? And his wife just cracked up laughing. And then he was laughing, and then he was like, hey, you guys are ganging up on me. And this kind of playful chiding is often a part of close relationships with friends or lovers. But there's, romance isn't just for lovers. In fact, I guess a couple nights ago I was remembering some of my closest relationships with males who were my best friends, and how incredibly romantic it truly was. We we're always raising the bar for our relationship and each other, challenging each other, creating together, discovering together, processing together. And it was deeply, profoundly beautiful in a way that I've really only experienced in very close friend relationships with other males. Although I've had close friendships with females as well, and there's some of that same play and development in those relationships, but my two dearest friends who I remember, Miles and Gary, it's sad that those relationships broke apart over time, and perhaps I'm responsible for their breaking. But I just remember waking up and being so happy to be with my friend. Like, together we were unstoppable. We were magical. We could solve any problem. We were creative. We were learning to become human together. And that's a beautiful and amazing thing that I revere and respect and honor. I miss it. It was really like we were married, in a way. Often we lived together, or we were, right next door or something. Except there was no sexual eros, or at least there was no physical eros. There were other forms. There were kinds of relational eros that were really profound. And I don't like to think that I took them for granted. I don't think I did. In a related topic, I sometimes play games in the evening, and over the past few months, we had developed a crew to play together in the role-playing game that we play. And we played almost every night, and, we always worked together, always seen together. And then one day someone new entered the crew, and this person took a dislike to me for reasons that are unclear, though perhaps I have some hint of them now. And so something strange happened where that person blocked me, and they were always in the gaming party, and some wild miscommunication ensued, where I presumed that I had done something wrong, or maybe the people in my crew were upset with me and I didn't talk with them. And I asked them a couple of questions, but they never got answered. So there was a long pause, and I would see them online, but they didn't invite me to play, and I didn't join them. And this gets to a topic that's really fascinating, which is when our technologies, by seeming to connect us, actually produce a bunch of problems. Like the problem that happens when somebody urgently texts their lover and doesn't hear anything back. We have to try to wonder, why is this person I'm close with not communicating with me? We don't have to, but we're inclined to imagine all kinds of reasons why there's a pause. And this also goes to rhythm and synchronization. It relates to these aspects of our minds and relationships. And personally, I'm not a fan of most of this stuff. For lots of reasons, it seems very dangerous. Someone I know was talking about texting back and forth with a potential lover, and then suddenly receiving no response and no explanation. And I've heard so many stories where people tell me without saying these words that texting and email and interactions on social networks have caused them incredible pain and problems, often when there was actually no problem at all other than the fact that they couldn't figure out why someone had not yet responded back. Now, of course, not everyone is glued to their computer or phone. And then there are also, other patterns of behavior that are part of our lives that don't fit into text. But what astonished me about the story was that people who had declared to each other their romantic interest weren't having voice conversations. They were texting and emailing each other. And in text or email, it's so easy to misinterpret a message or to overinterpret the lack of a message. Right? Now we have to interpret pauses in a rhythm that's no rhythm at all. It's incoherent. And so I asked my friend, I said, wait a minute. So you guys were, you folks were negotiating your romance in texts and emails? And she said, yeah, we were. And I was so surprised because anyone today can make a phone call, hear each other's voice, perhaps even see each other's faces. But many modern people have become nervous about using the phone, hearing, speaking and being listened to. And I can understand some of that. Not everyone is as skillful at improvising speech and language and converting their thoughts and feelings, translating those into speech and language. And when we write, I guess the process is slower. We may have more time. Not always. But the idea that we would communicate in text is catastrophically toxic. Text is interpreted in all kinds of different ways that usually have a lot to do with what's been going on in the last few minutes or hour with the person reading it. And whatever they've been exposed to, like the communications context collapses into nonsense, really, into incoherence, because it's really easy to misinterpret text and there's no music in it. And since there's no music, it's really difficult to validate whatever we may, our interpretations. Right? And this is a staggering problem that's very old now. I saw it happen when email was first introduced. I became aware of it and actually lost some important relationships because instead of talking on the phone, we were emailing each other in text. Now, text has its uses, but this isn't one of them. It's not a good one. And certainly there are people who can, sort of adjust to the modern situation. But it's also crippling because we need to have the experience of improvising together and learning to express our thoughts and feelings not only in words but in music, the music of our voices, the music we make when we're together. And so this seems to me something we can learn a lot from observing. Right? It's a kind of science fiction-y experiment gone haywire. And I don't want to project it too far into the future because it looks like we're going to lose a bunch of faculties that are really important to our capacities for communication. And surely it would be, wonderful to be able to touch one another and see one another in real time in the same space And we hopefully will all have some experience of that. But this problem with interpreting the gap, we were texting back and forth for the past 10 minutes very regularly, and then suddenly one party goes silent. We don't know what that means. And we're inclined to interpret it with our fears and insecurities, right? We're inclined to interpret it with feelings that can be triggered by nothing more than the interruption of a flow of text. And it was very uncommon to have that problem with speaking, and when we did, we knew there was some trouble, right? If we're speaking with someone and suddenly they just stop talking and look at us, this is a call for us to pay closer attention and to realize, hey, we lost the contact even though we're in the same room, right? Can you tell that we've lost the contact? And are you paying attention, or are you just blathering on with face noises? Well, this is a really deep topic. Of course, most topics are deep if we go deep with them. But I want to encourage you to be very careful with these technologies. In contexts that are counterfeited and compromised and filled with surveillance and analysis, our ordinary human cognition warps against itself. And it warps against absences we might interpret as meaning something that they never did, except in our interpretation. As somebody who's very carefully watched the development of electronic technologies, there were problems with this, with the telephone too. Long ago, before there were computers, there were troubles with telephones like this. And before that, perhaps with letters. Right? Why have they not sent me a letter? We used to send a letter every week. And this week, no letter came. Back then, you couldn't just call to find out what was wrong. Although if the person was near you, you might travel to them to find out what's going on. And I feel great compassion for people born in the past 20 or 30 years, because they're being born into a context they don't know the history of. They're being born into a context where communicating by text seems to them normal, or even safer than having a conversation together. And that won't work. That can ruin minds. There will be some exceptions. It doesn't only wreck us. There are some useful features of the capacity to text someone you're in a relationship with. But most of those features are pragmatic and, different from the goal of deep communication, right? They're like, could you pick up something at the store, right? That's not a bad use for text. I'm going to be out doing my laundry for a while, but when I get back, let's talk. No problem there. But when people are texting intensely, they're inclined to just form wild fantasies that may have little or nothing to do with what's actually going on between them. And part of that is because the musical aspect is missing, but another part is because in many cases, the entire relationship has taken place primarily in text and sending each other photographs. To someone of my generation, that's not merely unthinkable. It sounds like bad science fiction, right? Like dystopia. So this is something that deeply concerns me, and we can transform it together, but in the current context, that's not really on the agenda. For now, things continue to collapse in this direction. And for people who are unusually minded or who have unique ways of thinking, these situations present terrifying traps and real lethal danger. Anyone inclined to overthinking, and most of us are inclined toward that when we're isolated, and I use the term very generally, is going to have catastrophic trouble with texting and frequency and rhythm in relationships that aren't embodied together in real time, whether it's with a voice conversation or time spent with one another in physical presence. And of course, there's been a lot less of that lately. So I must imagine that the prevalence of this problem and the problems that surround it has probably exploded over the past 12 months. But the idea that two adults, people in their late 30s would pursue a romantic relationship primarily in text exchanges seems to me bizarre. Especially if there's deep, feelings and hopes, passions and concerns. So yeah, this interpreting the pause problem. When I finally reconnected with my gaming group, they said, well, we were as confused as you. We didn't know why you weren't with us. The other guy wouldn't tell us why he was upset, so we couldn't communicate that to you. And this went on for like a couple of weeks and was quite confusing. We were both, on both sides, everyone's trying to interpret the absence, And it's funny that a lot of our modern media is really about reifying the absence of our actual communality, right? Our actual mutual concern, engagement, relation, development. That stuff's mostly missing, so what happens is that the absence gets reified, and suddenly we are supposed to be surprised that plants are cooperating with each other. Even the idea of cooperation is a bit wonky here, because what's really going on is something really much deeper. It is that they are organs of each other's bodies. And on Earth, that's pretty much what's going on. Most of life is profoundly symbiotic, with the exception of the humans, by and large, they're collectives, which are abiotic, right? They're anti-life. They kill vast ecologies every day, all day long, and their only thought is, how many fish can we get in the freezer to ship back and can and package and put numbers in machines? Well, fortunately, that agenda is going to be deeply and profoundly disrupted as the carrying capacity of the Earth undergoes catastrophic transformations in the wake of the past perhaps 100 or 200 years of human behavior. Not that we didn't have an effect before, but we were only once we were able to mechanize that effect could we radically, geometrically increase the damage per day, per minute. And even if the numbers don't go up, the impact increases geometrically over time, or at least in a nonlinear way. Now, it's relatively natural for us to interpret gaps, right? When something's always there and suddenly it's not, something we rely upon or love or gives us comfort, then we may have questions about why. But in the context of email and texting, there's many really deep and bizarre problems that arise unnecessarily, simply because we were expecting a rhythm to continue and suddenly it didn't. And then we had to think about why. And sometimes this is very important, because sometimes there is something going on that relates to the relationship and us, but much of the time there isn't, and then the person who's, concerned is very likely to overthink it and come up with delusional explanations, right? Oh, they're mad at me. Oh, they hate me. Oh, they're seeing someone else. Oh, they decided I wasn't interesting. Oh, I did something wrong. And that one thing right there, I did something wrong, is one of the fundamental concerns for human beings in relations. And so, if we have done something wrong, clearly I did something that upset this guy in our gaming team, but he wouldn't talk to me about it. And he wouldn't talk to anybody about it. So we never really found out what it was, although once we were back together and we could process it, it was fairly easy to see what was likely. So these are my thoughts for today. I'm now at the point in my walk where I'll head home very soon and process this recording with my computer and glue an image to it and put it up on YouTube where some few of you will listen. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to learning and exploring again very soon. May your world be rich with beautiful relationships, adventure, learning, prosperity, health, and wonder. Bye-bye for now.